Hey, Michael with X-Force PC here. I've got something pretty neat today. So this is one of the first computers that I ever built back when we started our business. And so this PC would have been built around 1997, and that would make it 22 to 23 years old. And our customer used it for about 14 years to control a heating and air type system that you could, dial in with a 56K modem and control the heating and air system, and it would be managed by this computer. And the computer came with Windows 95 on it. And they gave it back to us and said, hey, this is one of the first computers you ever built. You might want to have it like in a museum piece. So, believe it or not, as I raise the camera, it still runs. Believe it or not, it still runs. So what we have here, this thing cost about $2,500. And what we have here is an Amd K5 PR120 processor. And I had to look this up to find out what is that. It's a 90 megahertz chip. So what is that? 0.09 gigahertz is what that would be. So 90 megahertz. And it had a 60 megahertz bus, and it ran a 1.5 multiplier. So 60 megahertz bus multiplied by 1.5 gives you 90 hertz, 90 megahertz. CPU speed. It came with 32 megabytes of RAM. That's 32 megabytes of RAM. That is ridiculously small. Obviously, a lot of the systems we build now come with 16 or 32 gigabytes, which is 1,000 times more. A gigabyte is 1,000 times bigger than a megabyte. Of course, the phone has to ring. It also came with a Western Digital 2.3 gigabyte hard drive. So a lot of our, most of our systems come with 8, 16, or 32 gigabytes of RAM. The entire hard drive in this thing was only, I think it's 2.3 gigabytes. So what I'll do is I'll take the cover off here in a minute. Now, it'd be great if I could go into the BIOS and show you what's doing in here, but this thing doesn't even have any USB ports. This was built before USB even existed, so I can't even show you that. Also, the keyboard port is not even PS2. That's the small round plug. This has an AT keyboard connection, which is what you would call a large round connection. It's about the size or circumference of a dime. So I'm going to now switch modes here and show you what's inside this thing. Alrighty, I'm going to try to duck down here a little bit, and let's talk about this computer a little bit more. Found it very intriguing. First of all, I'm going to take the cover off. And well, one thing you'll notice is the plastic has turned almost brownish up here, whereas the metal that's painted is this, sorry about the phone again, the old-fashioned beige color. One thing about these older computers, this is an AT computer, and it has a hard power switch. So the switch is right up here in the front, whereas today, when you press this button on a modern computer, all you're doing is shorting 2 pins on the motherboard and telling the motherboard to power on. This is like a physical switch, like a light switch that turns the power off and turns the power on. And that changed, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. Again, this is a 22-year-old computer. So, take the cover off. Now, what we have here is we have our graphics card, and then we have these various ports, which are serial type ports. I think what they had is they had a 25-pin external modem, 56K modem hooked to this. And so we had to put in a modem not a modem, sorry, serial port in the back of this for them to use it. And these all plug into the motherboard. And then you have your large round keyboard connector. Sorry, I've been working a lot of hours here with Christmas. The AT style keyboard connector, obviously the power supply is here. We have a 200 watt power supply in here. Now let's turn this around. This has a Trident graphics card. And I remember back in the day, you had the option, if I'm not mistaken, this is 1 megabyte of video memory built on. And then you could buy these chips to put in here, and you just kind of push them in, and that would add 1 more megabyte of video memory to give you a total of 2 megabytes of video memory. And it would simply allow you to run higher resolution on your screen. It had nothing to do with gaming or anything like that. And it went into a PCI slot. These are called, if I'm not mistaken, the funny thing is I built this computer and it's confusing to me, but I built it 22 years ago, or 23. These, I believe, are ISA slots. They're 16-bit, if I'm not mistaken, and then these are 32-bit PCI slots. And then there's a slot back here. I don't even know what this is, quite honestly. This is kind of right above the processor there, this darker tan slot. I'm not even sure what that is, quite honestly. Now, we have the hard drive, which would sit in this little tray. And of course, it has the ribbon style connector. And it's a Caviar 23200, which is 3,249 megabytes. So in other words, 3.2 gigabytes is what this is. And then we have 1 stick of RAM in here. Now what's interesting on this board is it has 1 RAM slot that's longer than all the rest of them. So I guess it supported 2 types of RAM. This doesn't have any labeling on it, so I know it's 32 megabytes, but I don't even know what beyond that it is. And then there's 2 little notches. You may notice there's a notch there and a notch there, so you don't put it in wrong. Now, I'm going to take this hard drive out and set it to the side. If you look in there, you can probably see that one of the RAM slots is longer than the other ones. And that's what this stick of RAM was in. And I have vague memories of this, but of what type of RAM. I remember there was EDO RAM and all that. And anyway, 23 years ago when I built this, I could have told you exactly what all these RAM slots meant. I can't even get the RAM back in there right. I'll do it later. So this is the AMD K5 processor. It consumed a whopping, I'll just look this up online, 10 watts. Now the modern processors we use today consume close to 100 watts. It's interesting, it still needed this cooler, but now that I'm feeling it, this cooler is just loose on here. It's just making contact. There's not even any thermal paste. So I'm gonna go across the room and grab a screwdriver. Will allow me to take this cooler off. It's amazing. So the cooler just sits on there with no thermal paste on it. Look at that. No thermal paste at all. It just sits on there, and I guess it keeps it cool enough because it's only drawing 10 watts. And there's the AMD K5 processor sitting on there. And you can, of course, read the writing on it because it doesn't have thermal paste all over it. And, of course, it's probably making terrible contact. I'm trying to pull it out of here. I don't know if I'll be able to. There we go. It's coming. But it just doesn't need a lot of cooling because it's only drawing 10 watts of power. So just the cooler just sort of sitting on top of there roughly is enough, I guess, to dissipate the heat necessary for this thing. I guess these are the VRMs. Nowadays you would see heat sinks on these, but these would be the VRMs, or voltage regulator modules. There's not a whole lot else to talk about, I guess, on this thing. You know, here are the cables running to the motherboard for those serial ports I mentioned. The only card in here is a graphics card. And of course, we have a floppy drive up here. But I just thought this was amazing. It's that it still turned on after 23 or so years. And I guess if I could acquire an AT, I know I'm cutting my head off, but I want you to see the computer. But if I acquired an AT keyboard, maybe I could even boot this thing up into Windows 95. So hopefully you found that interesting, and I know I did. And any of you into retro tech might find it interesting. It's weird too that it looks like it's an Intel chipset motherboard, but it's a AMD processor. So I guess back then AMD wasn't making their own chipsets like they do today. So there you go. There's a 23-year-old computer that I sort of know what's in it.